I think some animal testing is seen as okay, and in fact not just okay, but it's celebrated. And I think this because I've celebrated it, and I'll explain why. Now, I'll admit that's a heavy way to start a video, especially one that's focused on me drawing, but the subject of this drawing is a chimpanzee, and it got me thinking about the time I saw chimps being tested on and thought it was cool. Not your usual animals in a lab with chemicals kind of testing, but playful, non-invasive experiments. So for context, I make art, usually about animals, and I like connecting people to the subjects that I'm drawing or painting. I try to do this by finding stories or topics that can be difficult to talk about and, well, just talk about them. I read so many stories about our relationships with animals that end in just kind of unhappy ways, so I would love to do this in a solely positive and optimistic way, but realistically, I know that there are some things that just can't be framed positively. But I do think that a lot of times, if we just confront difficult topics, we can see that they're not often as scary as we think. And even if we're presented with a situation we don't like and can't yet change, that we can learn to be okay with it, even temporarily. Like addressing the fact that even though our opinions can be black and white, reality rarely is, and there is often some bad in the good and some good in the bad, which is where we'll find ourselves at the end of this video. So, like I said, chimpanzees are what I'll be talking about for this video. Specifically, how we learn about ourselves at the expense of this animal and others. I think for most people, animal testing creates a certain image in their mind, not a dog in a school uniform taking a maths exam, or maybe that's exactly what comes to mind, I don't know. But in reality, it's probably an image of an animal sprawled out on a desk, being prodded and poked, or in a cage experiencing the same thing. And to be clear, those are the forms of animal testing I do not agree with, even if I can accept that I have benefited from them and still do. Actually, those types of experiments normally use rats and mice and are done for a few reasons. One reason is pharmaceutical testing, which uses drugs and medicines on animals to see if they'll work for us. This is probably the one we're most familiar with, but there's also biomedical, which uses animals to study human diseases. It's actually an ethical requirement to use animals before human testing. Between just these two, though, scientists have been able to make huge changes and advancements in medicine, vaccines, organ transplants, genetic modeling, and loads more. And this point will actually be really important later on. But I did say these are not the ones I'm referring to when I say I've celebrated animal testing. Like me, I'm sure most people wouldn't be comfortable witnessing or participating in them, let alone celebrating them. The area of this work that I have celebrated is cognitive testing that's non-invasive. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it means that an animal's thinking and behaviors are being tested through challenges like puzzles. The fact that these tests are non-invasive eases a lot of my discomfort towards them because non-invasive generally means not causing any physical harm. However, there's another aspect, that is that these tests are voluntary, meaning the animals aren't pushed to do them or scheduled or forced in any way. Simply, they take part when they feel like it. Okay, so I've mentioned the type of animal testing I think is okay, but it's important to give an example. So I'll give the example I mentioned in the beginning with chimps. It was an episode of a show called Minefield, where the host Michael explores the cognitive trade-off hypothesis. Now, I felt very clever for deciding to watch that, even if I didn't understand what it meant at the time. But fortunately, now I do, and the cognitive trade-off idea is essentially this. Chimps and humans have a common ancestor. The last ones were alive about 6 million years ago, give or take. Then one group of that species broke off and evolved into chimps. Another broke off and evolved into us. Chimps kept their amazing ability of short-term visual memory, which let them remember complex patterns they saw almost instantly. However, humans adapted to life by developing language and complex communication, but according to this idea, that change from memory to language comes at a cost. Developing language demands a lot from our brain, so it may be that to use our brains for this, we sacrificed another ability like the visual memory that chimps have. In a nutshell, we gave up a more primitive cognitive ability for a more complex and social one. A brilliant idea, but we need to test it. And we do that by testing chimps and ourselves, which happened. In the show, the host Michael went to a facility in Japan where chimps were being experimented on, and not once did I think it was bad. The facility was being run by a man, Dr. Matsuzawa, who had worked with chimps for over 40 years. The space was huge. had lots of chimps and was designed to mimic their natural environment. Of course, how the chimps got there and why they were being kept there needs to be considered, but this wasn't included in the episode, so I won't address that here. Dr. Matsuzawa talks about the need for patience when working with chimps, and he designed his experiments to consider that. The chimps could only get tested when they wanted. When they were ready, they would walk up to the door for the test room, and the door would open automatically, and the chimps would spend as much time in there as they wanted. If one of the male chimps was busy flirting with the ladies, then no experiments would happen, hence the need for patience. Giving the chimps the right habitat is a huge positive, and non-invasive testing is another huge positive. But what I didn't realize until I watched this episode was how important it was to make it voluntary. This idea is consent. And if you feel weird about me using the word consent when talking about animals, don't worry, you're not the only one. I made a short video recently about how a field biologist found a rare kingfisher species and decided to kill it and preserve it. He described the bird's death as a sacrifice for future study, and I mentioned that to be sacrificed for a greater cause seems inappropriate if consent hasn't been given. The most common pushback I received was animals can't consent, which was my point then, and it will be here. Consent means to give permission. So does volunteering. So if it's important to say that the animal volunteers to take part in the experiment, we're saying it's important that the animal consents. Now, to be clear, in the episode, the researchers say the chimp chooses when it plays the games, and that sounded good to me. I just accepted that the animals were agreeing to do the study, and this is what made it okay for me. I knew the chimps were being experimented on, and I thought it was okay because I thought they were actually volunteering, I thought it was interesting, and I celebrated it. But I think I misunderstood something. They weren't agreeing. They couldn't agree because animals cannot make decisions in the ways that we do. They can't consent or volunteer in the ways that we do. To do so, they would need to be aware of what's at stake and what we're offering them, which to some extent they are, just only as far as do this thing and you'll get a treat you like. But true consent is informed, and animals cannot give informed consent. What I believed happened in this show was the illusion of consent, which is important because I believe it changes this chimp from being a player in a game to being just another animal tested on. But however we look at it, they are being tested on, so some people are saying it's okay. But saying if it's okay or not is an oddly complex decision because a lot of scientists and researchers really care about animals and aren't just allowed to use animals however they like. A quick aside, I'm about to use the term animal rights in this video, which there isn't really a kind of globally agreed definition for, so when I use it, I specifically mean an animal's right to not suffer for us. So researchers are required to consider animal rights, and to do this, most of them follow the 3 R's. First is refinement, which means to minimize as much pain and suffering to the animals as you can. Next is reduction, which is to use the smallest amount of animals possible. And last is replacement, which means to use something other than animals if you have the option. Essentially, the 3 R's are in place because there is a massive grey area in animal testing, not about animals' well-being. That line is super clear. The animals being tested on would be better off if we stopped testing on them. The grey area is people asking, when do an animal's rights disappear? Not will their rights disappear, because we know they eventually will. We just want to know where to draw that line and define when animal testing is okay. There are lots of layers to this issue, of course, and I cannot speak for the people involved, so I'll do my best to simplify the argument while still giving it the appropriate consideration. The widely accepted thing to do is to reduce the amount of suffering during these experiments. The disagreement seems to be about how best to do this. Pro-animal testers seem to say that following the 3 R's is sufficient because we still ultimately need to test on animals to make the kind of progress we've been making. Anti-animal testers argue we can and should completely remove animals from testing because there are other sufficient methods, and as appreciative as they are for the benefits we have gained historically, our understanding of animal rights has advanced to a point where we need to consider their well-being as much as our own. Now, I said at the beginning that we would find ourselves at the point that isn't black and white, but where there is some good in the bad and some bad in the good. The good thing is that there are people like the group PETA and groups like them who constantly fight for changes to be made in these spaces, but the challenge they face, the bad in the good, is to provide alternative methods for testing that work as well. The bad thing is that animals are still being tested on, but the positive part, the good in the bad, is that there are a lot of people who are currently testing on them that would prefer we didn't, and are constantly making changes to improve this. In fact, as recently as April this year, 2025, the National Institution of Health in America is making changes to reduce the number of animals involved in testing. Ultimately, I think whichever side of the coin you sit on, it's important to know that there are people on the other side that want the same thing as you. It just may not be in the way that you want it. In the Minefield episode, the host Michael asks, what can we learn about ourselves by studying chimpanzees like them? My takeaway is that the way we think is complex and probably needs more time to understand than a short YouTube video like this one. My thoughts on this are always changing, and I'd love to know what you think. So I'll put the sources I used for this video in the description below, so please read through them, watch the episode of Minefield and listen to the podcasts, and let me know what you think. Follow for more insightful art videos, and now, hopefully, you know a little bit more about and appreciate our relationships with chimpanzees.